Hello, welcome back to video 4 of the Bitty Bit Cuddle Baby pattern, and in this video we are going to make your baby's head. So grab your doll head making supplies that we talked about in video 1 and we'll get started. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to make a doll head using some of the supplies that you might have already at home. There's what we're making right there. So the first thing we need is some sort of tubing to fill to shape into a head. And so here's the tubular gauze that I told you about that I like to use. I'm going to cut about a 12-inch piece. It measures about 1 inch wide. And it works really great for making doll heads, but you don't have to use that. A couple of things I've used in the past are either socks, children's socks or baby socks, or a piece of knit fabric sewn into a tube like you see there in the middle. So basically if you want to do a sock, you just measure off the size that you need, which in this case would be 1 inch, about 1 inch wide, and you want to sew about on that inch mark there and make a back seam. I cut off the heel so it's not needed, and depending on how the toe is on the sock, you don't even have to close up the top of the sock usually. Usually you can just sew straight up to the end of the sock and that's all you have to do. You don't have to close up the top like we're about to do here. If you use a tube, you're going to have to close the top here like I'm about to show you. And to make this tube, by the way, you just need about a 4-inch, 4.5, or even 5-inch actually if you want to be on the safe side, piece of fabric, knit fabric, and you want the grain to be running north and south, those lines that you see in the knit fabric. And you just sew on the inch line, you measure, you fold it in half and measure about 1 inch, sew down and make that tube. And then once it's sewn, you need to close off the top. I like to do it with a gathering stitch, which is exactly what we did when we made the little pouch for the weighting material in the baby's belly. So I just made a gathering stitch, went across the other side, and then looped the thread around a couple times until I feel like it's secure. And then once I do that, then I take a couple more square knots just to make sure that it's secure and it's not going to slip. I do want it to be nice and secure. And that's all there is to it. You just turn it, right side out and it's ready to use. Now that one's a little short. That one doesn't measure quite 4.5, 5 inches long. That was just a piece I had on hand. So to use the gauze tubular bandage, you fold that 12-inch piece in half, and at that fold line you're going to do the same gathering stitch like we did on the tube that we just did. So once I get to the side, I turn around and I do a gathering stitch back, kind of in between the stitches I just made, and tie it off with a square knot. Some people like to, instead of sewing it like this to separate the two pieces, they'll just tie a knot, and so the knot would be there right in the center of the gauze, and that works great, but I think it works better for larger dolls. On these small dolls, the heads are so big, that knot tends to be kind of big. At least I have found that to be true. But you could do that, so if you didn't want to sew it, you could just make a knot. And the reason why we do that on the tubular bandage is that I like to do a double layer. Okay, so now let's talk about shaping the head. And like I said, I'm going to show you a couple different options. That's a felt ball, a wool felt ball. You can find them a lot at craft shops. You may even have some already. It's kind of a shortcut to make the head. That ball measures about 1 inch tall and it's 3-inch circumference. You can also use yarn like I'm doing here and basically roll a ball out of yarn. I'm using a wool yarn. And I start out really tight and make it really, really firm in the center, and then it kind of loosens up a little bit. And again, my goal here is to make a ball that's about 1 inch tall and about 3 inches in circumference. And so I keep it, just keep rotating it around to make I try to make it as round as possible. And once I feel like it's the right size, I just secure the end. Now you take those balls and we're going to cover them with some sort of stuffing material, like some sort of batting. So you could use polyfill here if that's what you have, or cotton or whatever. But you need to take this ball that now measures 3 inches in diameter, and you need to make it more like 4 1/4 to 4 1/2. So you need to get a piece of wool or whatever you're using and make it needs to be like a flat batting piece and about 4 inches square, at least 4 to 5 inches, and you may need to make it pretty thick depending on the material. What this is going to do is not only make the shape of the head, but it's also going to help make really chubby cheeks. So you need this square no matter what method you're going to make, how you're going to make the head. So whether you start with one of those balls like I just showed you, or if you do it this way, which is the way I normally do it, I take a piece of wool batting and tear it into a strip and then pull it out to kind of thin it out. You could use wool roving here too. And I just start rolling a ball. I just start rolling on itself, sort of like I did with the yarn. I start pretty tight in the center, pulling. I'm putting quite a bit of, I'm pulling pretty hard on that wool, trying to keep it as round as possible. I just keep rolling it around until I feel like it's getting close to the size I need it to be. And again, it needs to be 4 1/4 to 4 1/2 in circumference is our goal here. So that wasn't quite big enough, so I'm going to roll some more. Trying to make it as even as possible. And you don't want it too hard because you want to be able to tie. We're going to tie it up with string and stuff, and so if it's too hard, it's hard to tie and make those eye lines. And you notice how much bigger that ball is than that head, that finished head that I have sitting there, and it's because it's going to compress down. So that was a little too big. It measured 5, so I took off some wool. So now I'll take that little wool ball and I'm going to put it in my little squarish piece of wool that I measured off there, and carefully place it inside of my tubing. And I'm going to push it up inside that tubing. I'm putting quite a bit of pressure, pushing it up against where I've tied it off there, because I want it up there as tight as possible. And once I feel like it's pretty tight, I go ahead and pull down that second layer, and now I can begin tying it off. I use crochet thread, and I prefer the thinner one for the small heads. I cut off a piece about 18 inches or so. I like plenty of room to hold the string. I like to wrap it around my hands sometimes to get a better hold on it, so I cut a pretty long piece. So now we're going to tie the neck. I'm pushing that as I wrap that string around a couple times, and now I'm pushing that wool ball up some more towards the top of the tubing, and I'm pulling pretty hard, tying it, putting quite a bit of pressure there. Actually, I put too much pressure and I broke the thread, so that happens to me frequently when I use the thinner string, so I've got to start over here. So I'll be more gentle this time. So I'm pushing the wool down, I'm pulling that string down too, I'm kind of walking it down with my fingers, and when you wrap it a couple times around like that, it helps keep it from slipping the string. So now I'm being a little more gentle, and I go ahead and secure it with several square knots, and I trim it. So now your neck is done. You really want that neck really small, pulling out some excess wool there. You want that neck pretty small. The smaller the better, as far as I'm concerned. You want it as small as you can get it. So now I'm going to tie the eye line. Eye line is halfway in the middle of the head there, between the neck and the top of the head. I wrapped the crochet thread around again a couple of times to help hold it in place. And now I'm pulling quite hard here. I want that indentation where the eye line is pretty deep. That's going to give the shape of the head. Eye line is done. Now I'm going to do the chin line, and the way I like to do it is turn the head upside down, and I lay my thread over, and I lay that thread right up against the neck string, and I wrap it around a couple times. The top of the head, I want it right at the very top of the head is where I want the string to go, and the string down the side of the head is basically where the ears would be, you know, where it would meet the eye line. So it's like this, it's marking where ears would go too. That's a good way to, when you're looking at where the string is, to judge if it's in the right spot. So again, I'm pulling quite firmly. I'm compressing that wool down. The head is getting firmer and it has more shape, but we're still not quite done yet. I'm going to continue to use the black thread so you can see what I'm doing. I prefer though to use upholstery thread at this point. That's usually what I typically choose. So we're securing the two strings together, and where they meet, if you can imagine an X on top of those two strings, that's what I'm doing. I'm sewing an X going underneath both the strings, and I'm taking about 3 stitches on each side. You know, I go 3 stitches one direction and then I switch and do 3 on the other. When I'm done on that side, I just put my needle through the head and then proceed to do it again. And I'm digging down in the wool a little bit because I'm wanting to secure it under those strings. So I don't want those strings to move on the head right there. I want them to stay and not slip. So that's one side of the X. Now I'm doing the other side of the X, crossing over and securing those 2 strings. Once I do that, I just tie a square knot again, and then once I tie the square knot, I go right where that square knot is, I go right next to it, push my needle through and try to pull that knot kind of inside the head and just hide it away. Okay, so the strings are now secure. The next step is shaping. I'm going to use my crochet hook, although you could use your chopstick if you want to, or some other tool that would have a similar effect here. Basically, I'm just pushing the wool around where I want it to go. I'm moving the eye string on the back of the head down towards the neck a little bit, and I'm pushing the wool up as the head, you know, if you look at a person's head, the head narrows as it goes towards the neck. I'm also pushing the excess wool from the back of the head, kind of like where below the ears would be, towards the cheeks, and I'm puffing out my cheeks a little bit on the baby. And once, oh, and the other thing I'm doing, the chin line string, I pushed back. If you notice, it's not directly on the top of the head anymore. It's about halfway between the eye line mark, where the eye line was anyway, on the back of the head, and the very top. So once I like the shape of the head, then I secure this with thread as well. And I'm just taking little stitches over the string to secure it to the head. Normally I like to tuck in those spare, or those little strings left from tying. And for some reason I didn't do that on the top of the head. I don't know why. So the eye line, though, I'm now tucking the ends of the string in, so that's the best way to do it. It makes it much neater. Once I get back to where I started, I just knot it off and I'm done. So the head tying and shaping is done now. You have a choice here. You can different people do different things here. I'm pulling out some more wool, but basically I need to shape the muff is what it's referred to, and I think of it kind of like a spine. So it's all the wool that's hanging down below the head, below the neck, and we need to secure that and create a firm base for a couple reasons. One, that's going to secure the head so the head doesn't wobble around, and it makes a secure place to sew the head into the body. So it really does act sort of like a spine. It's called a muff, and this is the way I like to do it for the little dolls. I removed some of the wool because I don't want it too fat. I want it to be pretty narrow. And you can always add more wool at this point too if you took out too much, but I'm stuffing it down with my chopstick there. I just want it firm. And I'm securing my thread, sewing with a double thread again. And so now I'm securing it pretty much the same way I secured the little pouch with the weighting material inside the body. So I take a little stitch and I go all the way through to the other side, and take a little stitch again and go through the other side, and I do it in usually a clockwise motion. I'm at the very bottom of that stuffing material. I am going through it. I am going through that wool a little bit, and I'm pulling very tightly as I go through, and that tightens up the wool, it firms up the wool, and it becomes quite hard, like the head, this little spine that you're creating. It's called the muff. And I just continue doing that all the way around till I get back to where I started. And now I'm testing it. I'm shaking the head around, and I'm seeing, is the head wobbling at all, and it's not. It's completely firm, very secure. So now I'm knotting it off. Oops, I broke the thread. Again, normally here I use upholstery thread just because I tend to break regular thread a lot when I'm doing this kind of stitching. So when I break thread, I don't even try to remove the thread that was there before. I just start over and do it again and pretend like that other thread doesn't even exist. So I'm going to do that really quick here till it's completely secure. Knot it off, and I'm going to knot it off this time a little more gently so I'm not going to break it again. And you'll know that it's the right, you've done it right when the head doesn't wobble and it's a firm muff. Once I tie off that and clip the thread, I also clip off the excess gauze. So now the head's complete. You have a choice here whether or not you want to do a nose. It's completely optional. If you want to do a nose, the way you do it is you look at your chin line strings that basically go where your ears would be on the baby's head, and halfway between those in the middle of the head is you want to mark your nose right below the eye line. I'm marking it with a straight pin, and then you can just trace around the straight pin if you want. You just want to make a circle, make a spot so you can see where you need to do your stitching. So I marked around that pin, and it's kind of like sewing on a clock face, sort of, is what we're going to do. Again, I usually use upholstery thread for this. I'm going to use just black regular thread for this demonstration, so hopefully you can kind of see what I'm doing. You don't knot the end of the thread, it's not necessary. I decided here to actually mark looks like a clock basically, so I'm marking 12 and 6, 3 and 9, and then I'll just put dots for the rest of the numbers in between. Basically you're going to be taking your needle, you're going to be digging down in the head a little bit. I go in at 3 right outside the circle that I just drew and come out at 9, and I dug down and pulled some wool up underneath that needle when I went into the head. Don't knot the end of your thread, just leave a tail out that you can grab later. So now that I'm at 9, I'm going to go down at 8, and I'm going to come up at 2-ish, roughly. Basically halfway between your 12 and 3. Now I'm going to go in at 12, and I'm going to go down at 6. Now I'm pulling the thread all the way through, but I'm not pulling really hard yet. And you just keep repeating that. So see, I went in basically at, I don't know, like 4, and I'm going to go come out at 10, 11-ish, 10, and then now I'm going to go, I went back in at 9 and over back to 3, and so now I'm back where I started. You see that? So I've got the tail and my thread, and I'm looking at it. I've now pulled it pretty taut, and it's pulled the wool up inside that where I've basically sewn a circle, and it's not quite big enough, I don't think. So I've decided I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So I'm going to repeat that process, but this time I'm going to go outside where my other stitches were. I'm going to go further outside the circle that I drew. FYI too, when you do this, you probably want to draw a bigger circle than you think, because you're drawing up the fabric and it makes a smaller nose than what you think it'll be. And also, when we put the skin on, it tends to flatten the nose just a tad, so it does look a little smaller once it's skinned than at this stage. So now I'm pulling really hard. I'm pulling up that wool. Now I'm happy with that size, so I'm going to just do a square knot. Not too hard, because it's really pain right here. It's a real pain if you break your thread at this point. I've done it and it's a real pain. Okay, so it's done. I'm happy with it. So I'm going to go into basically where I had just come out, so I can kind of hide that knot I just made. I'm going to pull it through and do both of the ends here. I'm going to clip it here, and I'm going to hide the other end as well. I'm just going to thread the needle and pull it through the head as well, so it's hidden. Again, this nose is completely optional. You don't have to make a nose like this. You can have a noseless baby. The little white bunny that you saw in the opening picture is a noseless bunny. She has no nose. The blue one out of the blue sweater, he has a nose. There you go. Head's completely finished at this point, and we're ready for the next step, which is covering your head with skin fabric. So what I use is a cotton stockinette knit fabric designed for doll makers. It has there's no right or wrong side on this particular fabric, and it works great. However, my first dolls, as I mentioned earlier, were made out of t-shirt material, which is also a type of knit stockinette fabric. Even the gown here on this little doll is made from an old t-shirt of mine. The skin, though, I used an old white t-shirt, and I dyed it with tea, and basically, you can Google it, but basically what I do is I just use a black tea, make a really strong brew, and while that's brewing, I soak the t-shirt in water so it's fully saturated and wet, add that to the pot, and bring it to a low simmer, and let it sit until it gets to the color I like. And once it's that color, keeping in mind that it will dry lighter than what you see in the pot, then I just rinse it out, wash it and dry it, and it's ready to go. So now you have your skin fabric. It's about a 5-inch square, or excuse me, 5.5 inches roughly. You want to make sure that your grain is going north and south. There's lines in the fabric, and you want them to go north and south, up and down. Also check and see if you have a right or wrong side on your particular fabric. Mine is the same on both sides, so it doesn't matter. If, however, you do have a right or wrong side, make sure the right sides are facing one another and folded facing one another, so you're actually drawing and stitching on the wrong side. So here I'm making a placement of the head here. I'm on the fold. I want the front of the face pretty much even with the front of the fold, and once I have it even, I don't want it over, and then you don't want it too far back either, because that'll give you too much fabric on the face. Anyway, once it's lined up, then I rotate that muff forward a little bit, so to line it up also with the front of the fabric. And then I just trace around it with my pen, and what's left is, it looks something kind of like a wine glass. You're going to sew directly on this line, just like you did when you sewed the body. So I pin it in place so it doesn't slip around, or I lose that fold while I'm sewing. Now here I am at the sewing machine. You can hand sew this too, just like you did the body if that's what you did. I forgot to show you where to mark. You don't want to sew that whole line. You want to start right about at the crown of the head. You see where I marked there? and that's where you want to start. And I do take some back stitches just to lock that stitch in place and follow it all the way down. Super easy peasy here. Next we will trim the head skin fabric, and leave a very small seam allowance. Don't want any bulk there. I also usually put a few notches right there on the back of the head, being careful not to accidentally clip my threads. Turn it right side out, and I use my chopstick usually to help me, especially because that neck is so small, and also to press out the seam like we did on the body and on the hat, just kind of like finger pressing so that seam opens up and kind of lays flat. So now we need to place our head inside, and as you can see, that neck is really small. I make mine small for a reason. I like that it makes a free neck, so that's the reason why I make it so small. So I have to use something to help me pull that head in. You could make yours a little less narrow if you don't, if you would like. Some people do. I like to use my hemostats, which is definitely not a necessity. They're just a really great tool. They lock in place, so I insert them through the bottom, through the neck part, and grasp the head, actually the muff, and then I lock them in place, and then I just pull the skin up over while holding on to it. It just makes a really great handle, basically, so I can keep a hold of the head while pulling the opposite direction to pull that head up over, the skin up over the head. You could use a pair of tweezers, although the tweezers I have here are too small. I couldn't find my long ones, but I've had some long ones I've used longer. They're just regular tweezers, but they were longer than those. So you could use that as well to help facilitate this part. So the next step is we need to sew up the rest of the skin and close up the top of the head. I like to, usually I use a upholstery thread for this part. I'm using doubled regular thread, and that's certainly acceptable, but as you've seen before, I have a tendency to break my threads, so I just usually use upholstery thread because it's just safer for me to use. Usually I have less breakage. So the stitch that I use here is the ladder stitch, and I'll have a link to a really great tutorial. It's not my tutorial, it's another gal, and she does a really great job of explaining what the ladder stitch is, and you will use the ladder stitch again when we sew on, when we attach the head to the body and when we attach the hat to the head. It's a really great stitch to know if you don't already know it, and it's super, super easy. It's basically, once you get it stitched, the stitch itself is invisible for the most part. Some fabric it's less noticeable than others, and I'm using black thread here too, so mine's going to show up a little bit more because of the black thread. So I'm just sewing, going across each side using the ladder stitch, which is just taking a stitch directly across from the stitch I just took and pulling quite snugly to pull those two sides together. I'm also stitching about not quite a quarter of an inch in from the edge. I'm basically following the line that I drew, that I traced around. Remember, we didn't sew all the way up to the top of the head. You know, we started about right below the crown of the head, basically is where we started sewing it. So you'll be able to see that marked line, and also where you cut it, you'll see it. And the other thing I do here is I continue to trim as I go. Each head is a little different, so I usually trim it a little bit different, but I want to get rid of any excess fabric, so I'm just looking the whole time at how that fabric's going to lay, and if I can get rid of some of it. This is not, if you've never done this before, don't stress out if it's not really attractive, because number one, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's going to be covered up with the hat, and also this just takes practice to get it closed up neatly. At least it has been for me, and I still don't always get it perfectly neat. It depends on, you know, what what I'm going to do with the head. I mean, I try to always make it neat, but these little dolls, these with just a hat, the permanent hat sewn on, it's definitely not something to worry about. Now you notice I stitched the that front piece down, so I laid that in place. So basically now I just have these two sides that I need to close up. So I'm looking at the front of the head, and I'm looking at when I pull it up where the gathers are going to be, like, you know, the excess fabric, and I want to make sure it's far enough back on the head that it's not going to show, because if you're not careful, sometimes you can start to sew it into place and there's a little gather or a little wrinkle that's just a little too far down on the forehead, and it will show, you know, whether your doll has hair or whether it has a hat on or whatever. So you just want to make sure that it's basically that these stitches that you're making are all going to be underneath the hat or the hair, whatever kind of doll you're making. And in this case it would be the hat. I use a crochet hook or whatever, some kind of tool to help me kind of tuck the fabric in, and it looks like I need to trim it a little bit more there too. So this is really all it is. You just take stitches and tuck in the fabric as you go, and everybody has their own little method. You know, some people will just basically gather it all at the top. For some reason, with my great, amazing video skills, I somehow lost the rest of that. I don't know if my camera turned off, I don't know, but it's gone. So here's basically what it looks like when I'm done. Hopefully you can get a good idea of what it looks like from this angle. I want it good and secure, and I want those gathers where I'm pulling it all up to the top, you know, within the hairline. It'll be underneath the hat. And one last thing. So this part of the video was also lost. After you've completed sewing the top of the head skin on, we need to redefine the neck. So just like we tied the neck before we skinned the head when we were doing all the initial string tying and shaping the head, you're going to tie the neck off one more time. Just so you need to cut a piece of crochet thread, wrap it a couple times around the neck, as close up tightly right up underneath the head, as close as to the head as you can get, and securely tighten that down. So you can see that in the next video when we put all the pieces together and actually sew the head on. You'll see that I have it tied off, and that will give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. Yay! You have now finished your baby's wee head. Now in the next and last video in the Bitty Bit Cuddle Baby series, you are going to see how to put all the pieces together and finish your Bitty Bit Cuddle Baby.